It was a quiet Thursday morning in Flaxborough, the sort of morning that invited tea on the veranda and the polite exchange of opinions on the weather. The town's annual flower and produce show was in full swing at the community hall, an event more notable for the competitiveness of its exhibitors than for any real horticultural achievement. The hall smelled faintly of polished wood, chrysanthemums, and Mrs. Lacey's ambitious attempt at rhubarb wine. Mrs. Lacey herself, a formidable widow with the air of someone permanently judging, hovered near the prize table, inspecting the entries with sharp eyes that missed nothing least of all the absent-minded clumsiness of the town's younger gentlemen. Across the room, the Reverend Canon Hadley, dressed in sober black but wearing a faintly mischievous smile, leaned toward Mrs. Prendergast, offering unsolicited advice on the correct angle for cutting daffodil stems. Inspector Purbright, having been invited as a courtesy and curiosity rather than necessity, stood unobtrusively near the refreshments. He noted the precise order in which townsfolk approached the tea-urn, a subtle hierarchy revealed in hesitation, small smiles, and the careful avoidance of direct contact with the notoriously sticky hand of Mr. Dunsby, proprietor of the hardware store. It was the kind of observation that might seem trivial, but Purbright had long found that in Flaxborough the trivial often explained the extraordinary. The first stirrings of trouble were, as always, quiet and almost apologetic. A muffled exclamation drew Purbright's attention toward the back pews of the hall, where the elderly Miss Fairchild had stumbled over something protruding from beneath the polished floorboards. Kneeling cautiously, she extracted what appeared to be a small, velvet-bound notebook, its edges frayed, and a faintly suspicious smudge on the cover. "Good heavens!" Miss Fairchild exclaimed, her voice more scandalized than frightened. "This wasn't here yesterday, surely?" The hall hushed. Exhibitors paused mid-gossip, as if the notebook had grown to occupy the space of an elephant in the room. Mrs. Lacey's eyes narrowed to mere slits of indignation. "What impropriety is this?" she demanded. "It's nothing but a notebook," Purbright said softly, stepping forward, his voice carrying the sort of quiet authority that discourages interruption without requiring aggression. He crouched to examine it without touching, letting Miss Fairchild hold it at arm's length. "May I—" Yes, of course, Inspector," she said, trembling slightly, partly with age, partly with the thrill of attention. Purbright opened the notebook and leafed through it carefully. It was a record of church donations, remarkably meticulous, but with a few curious annotations in the margins, initials, dates, and the occasional cryptic note. "Missed this one. Check with Mr. Hawthorne. Too large, perhaps a mistake." He did not comment. Instead, he noted the reactions around him, the slight stiffening of Canon Hadley's posture, the brief glance from Mr. Dunsby toward the corner where Mrs. Prendergast busied herself with the raffle tickets. Even Mrs. Lacey, for all her outward composure, seemed to shrink slightly, as though the notebook's presence alone suggested she might have overlooked some personal failing. "I wonder how it came to be beneath the pew," Purbright said quietly, though more to himself than anyone else. His tone invited speculation without demanding it, a subtle cue for the gossip mill to begin its work. The room murmured. Speculation was never lacking in Flaxborough, and in moments like these, the town's quieter grievances tended to float to the surface. Who had placed the notebook there? Was it an attempt to expose some sin, a practical joke, or a mere accident? Mrs. Lacey huffed. "If this is some sordid attempt at mischief, I shall not stand for it. Our community has standards, Inspector, standards that cannot be trampled for the sake of amusement." Canon Hadley, ever the diplomat, murmured something about not jumping to conclusions, while Mr. Dunsby muttered that perhaps someone had simply dropped it in the wrong place. Even Miss Fairchild looked vaguely uncomfortable, as though she feared her involvement might be interpreted as intentional. Purbright, observing all of this, made no immediate judgment. He tucked the notebook under his arm with the care of a man handling something fragile, yet significant, and allowed the chatter to swirl around him. The town, predictably, did not wait for his guidance. Theories spread like dandelion seeds in a breeze. By the time the show's adjudicators reconvened, the flower arrangement seemed almost incidental, the conversations reduced to whispered conjecture, which local character had motive, who might profit, whose pride had been bruised. Purbright's eyes, however, tracked subtler signals, the fleeting expressions, the half-formed gestures, the tiny betrayals of posture and tone that often betrayed more than words ever could. And in that moment, as the first nervous laughter attempted to fill the awkward silence, Purbright understood that what had begun as a trivial discovery beneath a pew might, in time, reveal the quiet scandal lurking beneath Flaxborough's polished exterior. By the following morning, Flaxborough was thoroughly agitated. The discovery of the notebook beneath the church pew had spread faster than the usual gossip about Mr. Dunsby's ill-fated attempt to introduce automatic taps in his hardware shop. Housewives whispered over ironing boards, shopkeepers exchanged furtive glances while stacking tins of tomatoes, and even the butcher, who generally regarded local intrigue with a polite shrug, found himself lowering his voice as he described the peculiar little book to Mrs. Pettigrew at the counter. The town's reaction, as Purbright had long noted, followed a predictable yet oddly elaborate pattern: speculation, accusation, justification, and the occasional diversionary tale. In the post office, Mr. Hawthorne, a man with a tendency to interlace his conjecture with personal history, pronounced in an emphatic whisper that the notebook was clearly a sign of mismanagement in the parish accounts. "I've known Canon Hadley since he was a young fellow," he confided to anyone who would listen, "and he's as scrupulous as they come, but you never know what goes on when people are left unsupervised. A book hidden like that? Suspicious, if you ask me." Mrs. Prendergast, the mild-mannered owner of the village tea-room, took a different tack. She expressed alarm that someone might be attempting to embarrass the more respectable members of the community. "It's hardly the place for such things," she said primly to the two women arranging scones on the counter. "One can't help but feel someone is trying to test our character, if you follow me, B." The newspapers, which generally preferred sheepdog competitions and minor road accidents, scrambled to print an account. The Flaxborough Gazette ran a small item on page 3, framed under the polite headline, "Mystery at the Flower Show. Peculiar notebook found beneath pew," which inspired a cascade of letters to the editor. Each letter was more speculative than the last. Some hinted at embezzlement, others at romantic indiscretions, and a few at entirely imaginary transgressions involving Mr. Dunsby and a dubious quantity of tinned goods. In the midst of this quiet frenzy, Purbright made his rounds with a deliberate calm, speaking to individuals with the soft patience that had earned him both respect and occasional exasperation. He called first upon Mrs. Lacey, who was still meticulously cataloguing her flowers in the dining room, and who welcomed his presence as though he were an arbiter of morality rather than merely an inspector. She clasped her hands together with faint tremor. "Inspector, this has thrown the entire show into disarray." "I don't know how anyone could be so thoughtless." Purbright inclined his head politely. "Certainly, Mrs. Lacey. It is curious, isn't it? One might imagine the book simply fell, yet its placement seems deliberate." She huffed, arranging a row of carnations with exaggerated precision. "Deliberate? You don't know the half of it. Why, only last week the vicar himself said." She stopped abruptly, as though aware she was treading dangerously close to speculation. Purbright allowed the sentence to hang, noting the faint, nervous twitch in her right hand. It was the sort of small detail he stored carefully in the mental ledger that often proved more telling than any confession. Next, he called on Canon Hadley, who received him in the vicarage study with an air of mild exasperation. The Reverend was seated behind a mahogany desk, hands folded over a stack of hymnals, his expression both courteous and faintly quizzical. "Inspector, I do hope this intrusion will not require lengthy investigation. The matter seems absurdly trifling, perhaps," Purbright said, choosing his words with quiet precision. "Yet triviality can often be concealed, interesting details." He allowed a pause long enough to suggest a subtle prompting rather than pressure. "I understand you have an interest in the flower show's accounts?" Canon Hadley's gaze flickered to the notebook in Purbright's hand. "I do, insofar as I ensure contributions are properly recorded. Beyond that, I would hope the town does not imagine a scandal where none exists." He paused. "I am not oblivious, of course, but to suggest anyone would plant a notebook in a public hall, well, it seems far-fetched." Purbright smiled faintly, a polite expression that invited more revelation than it revealed. "Yet, as you say, one cannot be oblivious to human nature. Even the seemingly far-fetched sometimes occurs." From there, Purbright moved on to the slightly less obvious figures. Mr. Dunsby, still suspiciously irritable about the notebook and the attendant gossip. Miss Fairchild, whose nervous energy made her words slightly inconsistent, and Mrs. Pettigrew, who tended toward mild exaggeration but whose knowledge of everyone's comings and goings was unmatched. Each provided small contradictions, minor inconsistencies, and fleeting glances that Purbright catalogued silently. By midday, the town's narrative had already begun to warp. In the market square, Mrs. Lacey's account of the incident was considerably more dramatic than the reality, suggesting not merely a mislaid notebook, but a deliberate affront to decency and a subtle test of the vicar's judgment. Children passing through the square repeated the tale in fragments, adding details of missing petals, suspicious shadows, and overheard whispers, which in turn convinced Mrs. Pettigrew that a conspiracy of monumental proportions might be underway. Purbright, observing from his quiet vantage point near the church gates, noted the collective energy. Flaxborough, like any town of modest size, had a talent for converting the ordinary into the extraordinary. What might have been a small clerical oversight became, under the lens of social expectation and human curiosity, a mystery worthy of speculation, analysis, and even mild moral outrage. Returning to the community hall that afternoon, Purbright observed as the flower show carried on with polite dignity, though the undercurrent of whispered commentary persisted. Each exhibitor arranged blooms with the same meticulous attention as before, yet each glance toward the back pew hinted at a subtle unease. The notebook, now safely placed on a small side table under Purbright's watchful eye, seemed to attract more attention than any prize-winning rose or meticulously carved pumpkin. A minor scuffle over seating during the raffle drew Purbright's eye as well. It involved Miss Fairchild, the local stump chemist's assistant, and Mr. Hawthorne, whose loud protests about precedence in the queue were as much about asserting authority as securing a prize ticket. Purbright noted that even minor disputes provided insight into human behavior, particularly when framed against the backdrop of communal tension. The town's reaction, in all its petty, measured complexity, revealed layers of allegiance, envy, and pride that might otherwise have remained invisible. By the time evening approached, Purbright returned home, notebook in hand, reflecting on the delicate art of observation and the peculiar way in which Flaxborough processed anomalies. The town had already formed its own stories, each iteration embellishing, distorting, and, in some cases, entirely fabricating elements of the event. And yet, amid the gossip and the polite outrage, he recognized the faint outlines of truth, subtler than any outburst or accusation, discernible in mannerisms, timing, and the quiet hesitation of the otherwise confident. It was, he thought, precisely these human inconsistencies that would guide him in the days to come. The notebook beneath the pew had done more than disrupt a flower show. It had offered a window into the town itself, revealing the private curiosities, restrained resentments, and unspoken alliances that collectively defined Flaxborough. And Purbright, with his patient eye and unassuming manner, intended to watch, listen, and wait, allowing the town to reveal its secrets to him at its own unhurried pace. The morning after the flower show disturbance, Inspector Purbright strolled through Flaxborough with deliberate nonchalance, a leather-bound notebook tucked under his arm. It was a morning in which the sun seemed intent on producing no dramatic shadows, yet the town itself cast a quiet intrigue over every cobbled street and garden wall. Purbright's steps led him first to the parish office, a modest room behind the church where accounts were usually handled with quiet routine. Canon Hadley received him with the same courteous calm, though there was a subtle tension in the set of his shoulders. "Inspector, I trust you slept well. I hope my office is adequate for your purposes." "Quite," Purbright said, seating himself on the stiff wooden chair that creaked under his weight. "I thought it might be best to examine the records at a measured pace rather than chasing after speculation." He placed the notebook on the desk, its velvet cover now familiar, its pages open to the cryptic annotations. Hadley glanced down, lips pressed into a thin line. "I assure you, Inspector, all is in proper order. There may be minor omissions, as in any ledger, but nothing that would merit concern." Purbright's expression remained polite, neutral, yet his eyes moved slowly over the details. Minor omissions, perhaps, yet one wonders about these annotations. They suggest a level of awareness that surpasses mere clerical oversight. Hadley inclined, his head not defensive but cautious. "Yes, well, we are meticulous and occasionally make notes for clarification, but I assure you no one has reason to conceal anything." The inspector's next call was to Mr. Hawthorne, who greeted him with a mixture of pride and suspicion. The chemist's shop smelled faintly of carbolic and fresh soap, the air tinged with the scent of lavender sachets perched on the shelves. "Inspector, I feared this matter might bring unwanted attention. Yet I thought, as a friend to the parish, I might offer my observations." "Please do," Purbright said, noting the precise way Mr. Hawthorne seated himself on the corner of the counter, one knee cocked slightly as though bracing for some revelation. Hawthorne's voice lowered. "I noticed the canon inspecting donations more closely than usual in recent weeks. I mentioned it to no one, naturally, but it seemed peculiar. And then the notebook. Its sudden appearance beneath the pew is suggestive, don't you agree?" Purbright made no immediate reply, instead letting the silence act as its own question. Hawthorne, like many in Flaxborough, filled the void eagerly. "I would not presume to accuse anyone, Inspector, but the town has its curiosities. People watch each other, and sometimes that observation leads to misunderstandings." Next, Purbright called on Miss Fairchild. She greeted him at her tidy garden gate, apron dusted with soil, a faint perfume of rosewater and chrysanthemums clinging to her. "Inspector, you've come about the notebook, I expect?" she said nervously. "I was frightened, I admit it. One never expects such things to turn up in the church hall." "Of course," Purbright said. "I am interested in your recollection of events. Any detail, however small, may prove useful." She fidgeted, glancing at the hedge as if it could provide answers. "Well, I did notice Mr. Dunsby lingering near the pews more than usual. I thought he was merely adjusting his hat. But now I wonder if he might have been." She stopped, uncertain whether to continue. Purbright merely nodded, encouraging, allowing her to voice her thoughts without pressing them into a definitive accusation. Returning to the vicarage later that day, he noted that Canon Hadley had summoned Mrs. Pettigrew for tea, a deliberate gesture of civility in which the townsfolk's gossip could be observed and gauged. Purbright took a chair at the edge of the conversation, listening as Mrs. Pettigrew spoke of flower show rivalries, missed opportunities, and the subtle competition that underpinned Flaxborough's genteel social order. "The notebook," Mrs. Pettigrew whispered, lowering her voice in exaggerated secrecy, "is only the tip of the iceberg. You mark my words, Inspector, someone is testing us all, and in doing so they will reveal more than they intend." Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. It was not that he expected overt confession, but the careful threading of human interaction often revealed contradictions more telling than the words themselves. Each participant in the day's accounts exhibited minor slips of attention, fleeting expressions or moments of hesitation, that when considered together formed a subtle pattern. By mid-afternoon he had spoken to nearly every individual whose name had surfaced in casual rumour. Mr. Dunsby, who expressed feigned irritation at the disruption, Mrs. Lacey, who continued to catalogue every flower with almost military precision, and even the younger council clerk, whose nervous glances betrayed a cautious excitement at being privy to what he imagined to be a major scandal. Purbright took note of the discrepancies, slight misstatements, repeated phrases, and the occasional defensive remark that seemed incongruous with the speaker's character. What became increasingly clear to him was that Flaxborough's gossip network, while remarkably efficient at generating speculation, often obscured the truth in layers of conjecture and polite exaggeration. Each statement, each clarification, carried with it a subtle bias, a personal agenda, or a desire to shape the narrative in accordance with one's own social position. Purbright did not rush to judgment. He simply recorded, remembered, and catalogued, knowing that human nature often produced its own revelations if allowed sufficient space and time. As the afternoon waned, he returned once more to the community hall. The notebook had been placed under careful supervision, and the town's attention had shifted to the prize distribution for the flower show. Yet, even amid polite applause and congratulatory handshakes, there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that every gesture, every polite smile might conceal a thought, an intention, or a small act of mischief. Purbright surveyed the scene quietly, noting a series of minor interactions, a fleeting exchange between Mr. Dunsby and the chemist's assistant, a whispered correction of pronunciation from Mrs. Lacey to the vicar, and Miss Fairchild's nervous glances at the pew where the notebook had been found. To the casual observer these details might seem inconsequential, but to Purbright they formed a lattice of human behaviour, subtle yet revealing, upon which the eventual truth would rest. By evening he returned to his modest lodgings, notebook in hand, and made meticulous notes. The day had offered a panorama of character, motive, and social nuance. While no definitive accusation could yet be made, the groundwork had been laid. Flaxborough, with its quiet intrigue and restrained tensions, had begun to reveal its texture, and Purbright, patient and observant, intended to follow the threads wherever they might lead. The following morning, the town of Flaxborough seemed to settle into its habitual rhythms, though a subtle tension lingered in the air, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the most routine interactions feel slightly charged. At the parish office, Canon Hadley was already reviewing accounts when Purbright arrived, the notebook safely tucked under his arm. The vicar's posture suggested both politeness and a faint defensiveness, a combination Purbright had learned to read with care. "Good morning," Inspector Hadley said, his voice calm yet containing a note of unease. "I trust your observations yesterday were not too taxing." "Not at all," Purbright replied. "Merely absorbing the environment, as one does in Flaxborough. I wondered if you might permit me to review the ledger in tandem with the notebook to see if any apparent discrepancies merit attention." Hadley nodded, acquiescing with measured restraint. "Certainly, though I must stress that nothing substantial is amiss. Purbright spent the better part of the morning meticulously comparing entries. The handwriting was precise, careful, and consistent, but the annotations in the notebook initials, small notations, and dates introduced a level of ambiguity that suggested intentional oversight. A curious pattern emerged. Several donations had been slightly altered in the accounting book to reflect lower contributions than those noted elsewhere. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone without a keen eye for detail. By mid-morning, the pattern had begun to suggest a candidate to the town's eager gossip network, though Purbright withheld judgment. Mr. Dunsby, the hardware store proprietor, had already become the focus of whispered conjecture. His proximity to the pews during the flower show, coupled with a reputation for minor financial eccentricities in the shop accounts, provided fertile ground for suspicion. Purbright observed him later that morning in the market square, adjusting a display of tins with a level of intensity that bordered on ceremonial. Mr. Dunsby noticed the inspector's gaze and offered a stiff nod, followed by a guarded smile that seemed just slightly too forced. Purbright made no comment, merely noting the gesture. Returning to the parish office, he conducted a series of discreet interviews. Mrs. Lacey, for instance, remarked on Dunsby's meticulousness, suggesting that he might take it to unusual extremes. "He fusses over every detail," she said, her voice sharp with the slightest tinge of exasperation. "One might think he has an entire ledger in his head, and heaven help anyone who might disrupt it." Miss Fairchild, meanwhile, added that she had seen Dunsby near the pews at odd hours, although she admitted she could not say definitively what he had been doing. "I thought nothing of it at the time," she said, wringing her hands, "but now—" "Well, one begins to wonder." Even Mr. Hawthorne, who prided himself on disinterested observation, found himself drawn into the narrative. "Inspector?" "It is hardly concrete evidence," he cautioned. "But Dunsby has been unusually attentive of late. His business methods are sometimes unconventional." Purbright allowed each remark to settle, noting the combination of fact, perception, and inference. He was careful to observe how the remarks were phrased, the hesitations, the carefully measured words, the faint attempts to appear impartial while simultaneously hinting at possibility. These subtleties, he knew, were as important as the spoken content itself. By lunchtime, the town's chatter had coalesced around Mr. Dunsby as the first obvious suspect. The subtle insinuations had grown into full-fledged conjecture. In the tea-room, Mrs. Prendergast relayed with gentle alarm how several patrons had whispered about the notebook, each recounting snippets of Mr. Dunsby's peculiarities. The chemist's assistant had even suggested, in a tone meant to be half-joking, that Dunsby might be testing the moral fibre of Flaxborough. Purbright, however, was unconcerned with the collective narrative. He had no reason yet to believe Dunsby guilty, only that human nature favoured a neat solution, particularly in a town where the temptation to assign blame often outweighed the consideration of subtler evidence. That afternoon he visited the hardware store. Dunsby greeted him with careful cordiality, his apron dusted faintly with sawdust and metal filings. "Inspector," he said, "I hope you are not implying anything. I have my business to attend." "Merely observing Mr. Dunsby," Purbright replied. "You understand the importance of clarity in accounts, do you not? Especially when minor discrepancies might arise." Dunsby's brow furrowed slightly. "I am precise, of course, but I have never been careless, nor would I." "Well, I see what you mean. People do make mistakes, Inspector, but one cannot accuse without proof." Purbright nodded. "Naturally, proof is essential, and sometimes proof requires patience. Yet, curiosity often emerges before evidence. A misplaced object, a small inconsistency, can provide perspective." Dunsby stiffened, though he retained a polite exterior. Purbright made a mental note of the brief flicker of unease, subtle, contained, and fleeting, but present nonetheless. It was these moments, he reflected, that often presaged significant revelation. In the meantime, the town's imagination ran ahead. Evening in the market square found children repeating embellished versions of the notebook story, traders exchanging gossip, and Mrs. Lacey sighing over her misplaced chrysanthemums with an air of moral distress. By the time Purbright returned to his lodgings, the narrative was thoroughly framed around Dunsby, a convenient target for the town's instinctive need for resolution. Yet Purbright was aware that the first obvious suspect was rarely the true culprit in such matters. The notebook, its careful annotations, and the town's reaction were all pieces of a more intricate puzzle. His task was to continue probing gently and unobtrusively, noting behavior, contradictions, and minor revelations that might escape notice in the swirl of gossip. As he sat at his desk, pen in hand, he reflected on the day. Dunsby's cautious demeanour, the subtle reactions of others, and the incomplete pattern of the ledger entries suggested possibilities, but no certainties. Flaxborough had provided its first suspect, yet Purbright knew that patience and attentive observation would ultimately reveal the true shape of events, and the town, in all its genteel propriety and hidden tensions, would continue to offer the clues he required. The morning after he had established Mr. Dunsby as the town's first obvious suspect, Inspector Purbright took a slow walk along the High Street, pausing occasionally to observe the subtle interplay of human behaviour in Flaxborough. Shopkeepers arranged their wares with precision, children dodged between baskets and benches, and passers-by murmured about the notebook as if it had acquired a certain gravitas overnight. It was remarkable, Purbright thought, how a trivial object could shift the rhythms of an entire town, transforming the mundane into a theatre of suspicion and polite outrage. As he neared the church, his attention was caught by a small, seemingly insignificant object lying in the gutter. It was a thin copper paperclip bent almost into a right angle, partially obscured by a fallen leaf. He bent to pick it up, turning it over in his hand. At first glance, it was unremarkable, one of those minute, overlooked details that normally escape notice. Yet Purbright's instincts suggested it might bear relevance. He placed it carefully in his coat pocket, noting that it had a faint trace of ink on one end. Inside the parish office, Canon Hadley greeted him with the habitual calm, though the inspector detected the slight tightening around his eyes that sometimes accompanied the early morning fatigue. "Inspector, good morning," he said. "I trust your observations are progressing?" "Indeed," Purbright replied. "I came across a small detail this morning," he said, producing the copper paperclip. "It may be nothing, yet I believe every detail deserves consideration." Hadley raised an eyebrow, regarding the object with polite curiosity. "A paperclip? How intriguing! I confess I do not see the significance, but I trust your judgment." Purbright did not offer an immediate explanation, instead tucking the item into a small envelope for later comparison. He had learned long ago that in Flaxborough it was the overlooked trivial details, items misplaced, gestures misread, minor inconsistencies that often illuminated truths concealed beneath the town's surface civility. He turned his attention back to the ledger and the notebook. The marginalia were precise, methodical, and yet hinted at something almost playful in their inconsistency. Certain entries had been annotated with initials that did not match the known contributors. Others had notes suggesting oversight, corrections, or small errors. Each discrepancy seemed minor, trivial even, yet the pattern hinted at a carefully constructed effort to draw attention without revealing motive. Later that day, Purbright made a point of visiting Miss Fairchild, who was tending her garden with her customary meticulousness. "Inspector," she said, brushing soil from her hands, "I do hope you are not troubling yourself unduly. These things have a way of seeming far more important than they are. On the contrary, Purbright said, small matters often carry great significance. I wanted to ask if you noticed anything unusual during the flower show, any detail that seemed odd but not necessarily alarming at the time. Miss Fairchild considered, eyes narrowing. Well, I suppose there was something, she admitted hesitantly. A slip of paper perhaps dropped near the pews. I thought it was merely a note someone had mislaid. Nothing more. Purbright's eyebrows lifted slightly, though he remained expressionless. Did it appear to relate to the notebook or the accounts in any way? She shook her head. I couldn't say, or it was too brief a glance. Yet now, in hindsight, I suppose it might have been significant. It was precisely these faint recollections, often dismissed at the time, that Purbright valued. They offered a glimpse into actions and behaviours that had escaped immediate notice, subtle hints that would later align with the broader pattern. By afternoon, he returned to the hardware store, ostensibly to discuss Mr. Dunsby's ledger practices, but in truth to observe him in his natural environment. Dunsby was arranging a small display of nails and screws, muttering under his breath about the inefficiency of modern packaging. Purbright watched him move with quiet attention, noting the precise angles at which he tilted boxes, the deliberate way he replaced items, and a subtle hesitation when a customer's glance fell upon the notebook resting in the corner of the store. It had been delivered there for safekeeping. A brief exchange between Dunsby and his assistant drew Purbright's interest. The assistant, a young man with nervous hands and eyes that darted too quickly, handed Dunsby a small slip of paper. Dunsby glanced at it, furrowed his brow, and then carefully set it aside without comment. The paper had the faint trace of ink, resembling the mark found on the copper paperclip Purbright had retrieved earlier. Purbright made a quiet note of the coincidence. Though it could be mere happenstance, it was precisely such minor inconsistencies that often indicated intentional communication, a concealed motive, or the careful orchestration of an event. He did not yet have confirmation, only a delicate thread to follow, one that might lead to truth or to misdirection, depending on the next set of observations. Later, in the quiet of the vicarage, he reviewed his notes. The juxtaposition of ledger entries, marginalia, the bent paperclip, and the small slip of paper observed at the store suggested a pattern emerging from disorder. There was method in what appeared random, purpose beneath what seemed trivial. The first obvious suspect, Mr. Dunsby, remained under scrutiny, yet Purbright's careful eye noted that human behaviour, especially when observed in a town like Flaxborough, often contained distractions, misdirection, and deliberate obfuscation. By evening he walked the narrow lanes of the town, notebook in hand, tracing the subtle pathways through which rumour, observation, and human folly intertwined. The town had already begun to assign culpability, to narrate its own version of events, yet Purbright remained patient. The trivial but odd detail, a paperclip, a misplaced note, a hesitation in movement, had drawn his attention, suggesting that the investigation would require meticulous observation rather than public accusation. Returning to his modest lodgings, he arranged the day's findings systematically. The first obvious suspect had been established, minor oddities had been noted, and the human network of observation, speculation, and motive in Flaxborough had been quietly charted. The puzzle was slowly revealing itself, one understated clue at a time. Purbright, ever patient, understood that truth often hid beneath layers of apparent triviality, and he intended to watch, listen, and wait until those layers were ready to yield their secret. Over the next few days, Flaxborough's social sphere seemed to broaden in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The initial scandal surrounding the notebook had begun to ripple outward, drawing in citizens who had previously remained quiet, untouched by the event. Inspector Purbright, as always, moved with quiet diligence, observing, listening, and making discreet inquiries, now turning his attention to individuals whose connection to the church, the accounts, or the flower show had seemed marginal at first glance. He first visited Mrs. Lacey again, this time under the pretense of inspecting her meticulously labelled prize chrysanthemums. She welcomed him with a degree of impatience tempered by curiosity. "Inspector, I do hope you are not about to accuse me of some impropriety. I've been sufficiently disturbed by that book." "Nothing of the sort," Purbright said. "Yet one must consider that small actions in Flaxborough can have unexpected consequences. Might I ask if you observed anything unusual during or after the flower show, perhaps interactions that at first glance seemed ordinary?" Mrs. Lacey adjusted a ribbon with precise movements. "Well, perhaps. I noticed the council clerk lingering near the pews more than seemed necessary. He is an obliging young man, yet the way he glanced at the notebook. One might imagine he anticipated its discovery." Purbright made a careful note. Small observations, especially those filtered through the lens of social perception, often revealed more than overt testimony. Next, he called on Miss Pettigrew, who managed the village tea-room and had proven herself an avid observer of the town's undercurrents. She welcomed him with an air of conspiratorial civility. "Inspector, I believe you should know," she said in a lowered voice, "that Mrs. Fairchild mentioned seeing Mr. Tilling, the solicitor's clerk, near the church early last week. He seemed distracted, one might say nervous." "Nervous? In what way?" Purbright asked. "Oh, you know," she replied, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. He glanced around, muttered to himself, adjusted his coat repeatedly. Hardly alarming to a casual observer, but noticeable if one is paying attention. Purbright acknowledged the comment with a quiet nod. Patterns of behavior, slight nervousness, or unnecessary attentiveness often proved more instructive than declarations of intent. Later he visited the chemist's shop, where Mr. Hawthorne offered further subtle hints. "Inspector, I mentioned Dunsby's meticulous nature," he said. "Yet upon reflection I am struck by the activities of Mrs. Sinclair, the postmistress. She delivered several small envelopes that seemed inconsequential at the time, yet her timing always coincided with Dunsby's presence near the church." Interesting. Purbright noted the interconnection. Small threads were weaving into a more intricate fabric: the hardware store, the post office, the vicarage, the flower show hall. Each individual, while acting according to ordinary daily routines, inadvertently left traces that, when viewed collectively, suggested patterns. The inspector's attention then turned to Mr. Hawthorne's assistant, a young man who seemed to hover constantly at the periphery of town events. A casual remark made by the assistant to the chemist, overheard by Miss Pettigrew, suggested a familiarity with the notebook's unusual annotations. Purbright, quietly observing their exchange, made careful notes on timing, emphasis, and the precise words used, all the while noting the subtle deference shown to the elder chemist. By midweek, Purbright began to compile a more comprehensive map of activity. The first suspect, Dunsby, remained relevant, yet additional figures now merited attention. The council clerk, Mr. Tilling, Mrs. Sinclair, whose mail deliveries seemed innocuous but timely, and Hawthorne's assistant, whose unobtrusive presence hinted at a curious awareness. Each had their own minor motives or social opportunities, though none were immediately indictable. The town itself seemed to sense this expansion of scrutiny. The market square hummed with whispers about the individuals now entering the narrative. Children giggled about the mysterious comings and goings. Shopkeepers exchanged knowing looks over the arrangement of bread loaves and tomatoes. Even the Reverend Canon, while maintaining his customary serenity, seemed slightly more vigilant during his morning walks. Purbright, for his part, treated these social ripples as data points rather than proof. He had long understood that towns like Flaxborough operated on multiple levels: the visible surface of civility, the subtle undercurrent of observation, and the hidden interplay of small grievances, minor ambitions, and carefully concealed resentments. It was within this interplay that the real clues often emerged. One afternoon he returned to the church, ostensibly to inspect the pews where the notebook had been found. He observed the floorboards with quiet patience, noting slight scuffs, irregularities in varnish, and the faint indentation of what might have been a small object left beneath the pew for a period of time. These minor physical traces were, as always, instructive when combined with behavioral patterns. He also observed interactions among the town's inhabitants. Mr. Tilling appeared at the church gates, adjusting his coat in a familiar pattern. Mrs. Sinclair passed by with a stack of envelopes, seemingly casual, but pausing momentarily to glance toward the pews. Hawthorne's assistant lingered near the chemist's doorway, glancing occasionally toward the church. Each movement was ordinary, yet collectively they formed a lattice of connection. By evening, Purbright returned to his lodgings with a growing sense of the investigation's complexity. The field had expanded from a single, obvious suspect to a network of minor players, each contributing to the subtle puzzle beneath the town's calm exterior. The notebook had proven its value as a catalyst, revealing not only potential motives but also the intricate social choreography that defined Flaxborough. Sitting at his desk, Purbright reflected on the day. The town had begun to reveal itself in fragments. Gestures, hesitations, and minor deviations from routine offered insights far richer than overt statements or accusations. He had observed behavior across multiple individuals, noting discrepancies, coincidences, and faint signals of unease. The first obvious suspect had given way to a more complex picture, one in which human foibles, modest ambitions, and carefully concealed intentions intertwined. Flaxborough, as always, continued to operate on the surface of polite order, while beneath that veneer the quiet, intricate workings of social expectation and human nature had begun to illuminate the path of inquiry. Purbright understood that the truth would not emerge in haste, but through careful, patient observation, allowing the town to reveal its secrets in due course. It was late in the week when the town of Flaxborough encountered a second disturbance, one that, though far less dramatic than the discovery of the notebook, served to complicate the emerging web of suspicion. On a dull Friday morning, Canon Hadley arrived at the parish office to find the vicarage garden gate ajar and the hedges slightly dishevelled. The alteration was minor, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, yet it immediately attracted the attention of Mrs. Lacey, who insisted on sending a telegram of concern to every flower show participant, whether present or absent. Purbright, having been summoned for his insight, examined the scene with deliberate patience. Nothing appeared stolen or damaged, yet a faint indentation in the soil suggested someone had lingered near the shrubbery for several minutes, perhaps observing, perhaps leaving something behind. And indeed, when he leaned closer, he discovered a small envelope, worn at the edges, tucked carefully beneath a low branch. The handwriting on the envelope bore no name, only the initials HT, faintly smudged as though it had been handled in a hurry. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, neatly folded. On it, a series of numbers and letters appeared in a seemingly arbitrary arrangement, with a small annotation at the bottom for attention, discreetly. Purbright studied it carefully, noting the familiar precision in the ink strokes and the same meticulous care evident in the notebook found beneath the pew. The coincidence was intriguing. While the first incident had involved what appeared to be a minor clerical curiosity, this second act introduced intentionality, a deliberate signal intended to be found. News of the envelope spread swiftly, though not as dramatically as the notebook. Yet the subtle shift in the town's mood was perceptible. Citizens moved with slightly more cautious observation, glances lingered, and whispers circulated concerning the mysterious instructions left in the vicarage garden. Mrs. Pettigrew, attending her afternoon tea service, remarked to a group of loyal patrons that Flaxborough had become a town of secret correspondences and hidden messages. "I dare say," she added in a tone of gentle alarm, "we are being tested in ways none of us imagined." Purbright, conversely, allowed the town's nervous energy to unfold without comment. The new incident did not provide direct accusation, only additional threads. The field of potential suspects expanded quietly. The initials suggested a connection to Mr. Tilling, whose clerkship in the solicitor's office often required attention to codes, addresses, and sensitive documents. Alternatively, the envelope could relate to Hawthorne's assistant, whose careful attention to minor details had not escaped Purbright's notice in previous days. Later that morning, Purbright visited Mr. Tilling at the solicitor's office, a modest establishment with shelves of well-worn legal tomes. Tilling greeted him with his habitual decorum, though a faint twitch in his left hand betrayed a trace of nervousness. "Inspector," he said politely, "I hope your visit is not disruptive. I am quite preoccupied with estate matters and correspondence." "Only a brief observation, Mr. Tilling," Purbright replied. "I noted the envelope in the vicarage garden. Perhaps you can clarify your movements over the past several days purely for my understanding." Tilling's brow furrowed in mild confusion. "I was, of course, attending to my usual duties, letters, client visits, nothing of any particular note." "I cannot imagine that a minor slip, a letter left astray, should provoke such attention." Purbright allowed a moment of silence, watching Tilling carefully. "Sometimes minor slips are anything but accidental," he said quietly, "and the timing of your presence near the church coincides intriguingly with both the envelope and the prior notebook incident." Tilling shifted uneasily in his chair. "I assure you, Inspector, I have no involvement. I would never deliberately sow confusion or suspicion." "Of course," Purbright replied, nodding. "Yet one observes, records, and compares. It is remarkable how human behavior can reveal itself, even in what appears to be routine." From there, Purbright made a point of speaking with Mrs. Sinclair, the postmistress, who had been noted for her timely deliveries coinciding with Dunsby's movements. She received him in her small office, a faint aroma of ink and paper pervading the room. "Inspector," she said, "I have tried to mind my own business. Letters are delivered, envelopes placed. I would not wish to involve myself in anything untoward." "Certainly," Purbright replied. "Yet I wonder if you observed any unusual correspondences, perhaps envelopes that did not match their expected content or handwriting." She hesitated, glancing toward the window as though seeking reassurance from the passing town. Perhaps one letter seemed odd, slightly out of place, but it could have been an error. I did not think it worth remarking upon at the time." By the afternoon, Purbright had catalogued minor discrepancies and coincidences, observing patterns that might otherwise have seemed random. The town itself appeared more conscious, almost wary. Shopkeepers paused to exchange glances over counters, children whispered with cautious giggles, and even Canon Hadley walked a little more deliberately, as though aware that subtle observation might reveal more than overt action. The second incident, though modest, had a profound effect. It shifted the investigation's focus, demonstrating that the first suspect, Dunsby, while convenient for the town's gossip, might not be directly involved. Instead, the series of minor but deliberate acts suggested coordination, forethought, and an understanding of the town's intricate social patterns. As evening fell, Purbright returned to his lodgings, notebook and envelope in hand. He laid the items side by side on his desk, examining the similarities in handwriting, notation, and intention. The town's first narrative that Dunsby alone might bear responsibility was now complicated by evidence that hinted at a network of involvement, or at least a more subtle hand manipulating appearance. He reflected on the day, noting that Flaxborough, with all its genteel order and polite proprieties, had a complex lattice of human interaction beneath the surface. Each individual, consciously or unconsciously, contributed to a broader pattern of behavior that revealed motives, opportunity, and subtle hints of mischief. The second incident had clarified one principle: the investigation would not advance by focusing solely on the first obvious suspect. Observation, patience, and the careful weighing of human behavior would be required to discern the truth hidden beneath the town's calm exterior. By the time the week drew toward its close, Inspector Purbright had settled into a rhythm of observation, reflection, and quiet inquiry. Flaxborough's streets appeared serene, lined with tidy houses and flowering gardens. Yet beneath this outward calm, the intricate web of human interaction continued to reveal its subtleties. Purbright often found himself walking alone in the late afternoons, not merely to survey the town, but to allow his mind to sift through the patterns of behavior he had catalogued over the preceding days. He began by considering the town's response to the two incidents, the notebook beneath the church pew and the envelope in the vicarage garden. Both had introduced anomalies into the otherwise meticulous order of Flaxborough life, yet the town's reaction differed in nuance. The first incident had galvanized speculation and assigned a convenient culprit. The second had injected a subtle uncertainty, prompting citizens to observe, hesitate, and reconsider. It was, Purbright noted, a microcosm of human nature. The rapid formation of narratives, followed by the slow erosion of certainty, as evidence, however trivial, introduced doubt. In reflecting on human behavior, he thought first of Dunsby, whose meticulous habits and slight gestures of unease had drawn suspicion. There was nothing overtly incriminating in Dunsby's actions, yet his reactions, measured as they were, provided one data point among many. Purbright considered how the town had latched onto him as an initial focal point, and how social convention often demanded the identification of a single individual upon whom collective anxiety could be projected. He also reflected on the council clerk, Mr. Tilling, whose nervousness and occasional furtive glances had been noted. While Tilling exhibited no overt misdeeds, the timing of his movements suggested a peripheral involvement, or at least an awareness of events that merited further consideration. Similarly, Mrs. Sinclair's precise deliveries and minor deviations in routine hinted at a subtle network of observation, perhaps unknowingly contributing to the unfolding of events. Purbright allowed himself a quiet smile at the predictability of Flaxborough's residents. Each person's character, social standing, and habitual gestures were, in aggregate, as revealing as any explicit confession. He considered Mrs. Lacey's meticulous attention to her chrysanthemums, Miss Fairchild's slight overreactions, and the chemist's assistant's discreet attentiveness. Each had been catalogued, noted, and quietly compared to the emerging timeline of events. A minor thought occurred to him. Human beings were creatures of habit, yet habit could disguise intention. The subtle interplay between routine and deviation was the key to understanding concealed motives. He revisited the first trivial observation, the bent copper paperclip, smudged with ink, and connected it with the envelope found later. Both indicated a degree of deliberation and caution. Both suggested someone aware of the town's watchful eyes and the predictable patterns of behavior that defined it. He also pondered the importance of timing and context. The notebook had appeared beneath the pew at the flower show, an event designed to showcase civility, order, and mild competition. The envelope had arrived during a period of otherwise ordinary activity, in a location associated with routine observation and minor social interaction. Both incidents, though minor in material terms, had strategically manipulated the social environment to ensure attention. Seated at his modest desk in the evening, Purbright made careful notes, reflecting on the emotional currents at play. Fear, curiosity, ambition, and pride intertwined to produce reactions that, while outwardly polite, betrayed an undercurrent of human frailty. The notebook and envelope were less about the objects themselves and more about the way they had orchestrated a sequence of observations, gestures, and revelations. Purbright also considered the town's tendency toward gossip. Observations were often filtered through personal bias. Minor grievances, unspoken rivalries, and the occasional delight in perceived scandal shaped how information circulated. Yet the gossip, for all its distortion, provided indirect confirmation of behavioral patterns. He could trace movements, measure hesitation, and discern subtle alliances through the way people spoke, glanced, and reacted. By candlelight, he reviewed the list of potential participants in the unfolding mystery. Dunsby remained a figure of interest, though the evidence against him was circumstantial. Mr. Tilling's peripheral presence suggested awareness rather than action. Mrs. Sinclair's timely deliveries hinted at incidental involvement or careful observation. Hawthorne's assistant, meanwhile, remained a quiet figure, attentive and precise, whose gestures had not gone unnoticed. Each individual contributed to the evolving tableau, yet no single act could yet be identified as decisive. Purbright reflected further on human psychology. The inclination to assign blame, the subtle satisfaction in observing minor transgressions, the careful concealment of intention beneath polite exterior, all were natural, all were predictable, and all were potentially revealing. Flaxborough, in its quaint orderliness, offered a rich tapestry of minor contradictions, fleeting expressions, and subtle inconsistencies. The inspector also considered the importance of waiting, of allowing patterns to emerge organically. A hurried conclusion risked misattribution, whereas patience could reveal the deliberate orchestration of otherwise trivial events. The notebook beneath the pew and the envelope in the garden were not crimes in themselves, but were instruments designed to prompt observation, to expose subtle reactions, and to provide insight into the town's inhabitants. As night settled over Flaxborough, Purbright sat back in his chair, pen poised above the notebook, contemplating the intricate web of human behavior he had observed. The town's residents were, in their measured ways, revealing their tendencies, loyalties, and anxieties. The second incident had clarified a critical point. The investigation must account for the network, the pattern, the orchestration, rather than focusing solely on the first obvious suspect. Purbright made a final note for the evening. The truth, as always, would emerge not through hasty accusation, but through attentive observation, subtle comparison, and the patient alignment of minor, seemingly trivial details. Flaxborough, in its polite and restrained manner, had provided the raw material for discovery. The next steps would require careful probing, gentle questioning, and the deliberate testing of human behavior, all in the service of uncovering the truth hidden beneath the town's calm and orderly exterior. Early the following week, Inspector Purbright set about arranging a series of subtle observations, small encounters designed to gauge reactions and draw out inconsistencies. The town, still abuzz with whispered speculation over both the notebook and the envelope, presented a rich canvas for his quiet testing of character and motive. It was not through confrontation that he intended to discover the truth, but through controlled interaction and careful attention to human behavior. His first step was to invite Mr. Tilling, the council clerk, to the vicarage under the pretense of reviewing a minor discrepancy in the flower show's prize records. Tilling arrived promptly, clutching a portfolio of papers, his demeanour polite, yet faintly tense. Purbright greeted him with calm courtesy. "I thought it might be useful to verify a few entries in your presence, purely for clarity," he said. indicating the ledger and notebook. A second pair of eyes often reveals what a single observer might overlook. Tilling leaned over the desk, hands slightly trembling as he adjusted his spectacles. "Of course, Inspector, I am more than willing to assist, though I assure you I have observed nothing untoward." Purbright allowed him to examine the documents for several minutes, noting the precise timing of his gestures, the fleeting glances toward the notebook, and the almost imperceptible hesitation when he reached certain pages. "You are meticulous," Purbright observed quietly. Yet one wonders how often attention to detail leads to the discovery of unexpected matters. Tilling's reply was measured, polite, but just slightly defensive. "Indeed, Inspector, though I cannot imagine such minor entries warrant the degree of attention you suggest." Next, Purbright arranged a meeting with Mrs. Sinclair, the postmistress, under the pretense of discussing routine deliveries to the parish. She greeted him with her usual calm, yet Purbright detected a subtle stiffness in her posture, a heightened awareness of the surroundings. "Inspector," she said, "I deliver letters, of course. I do not wish to intrude upon matters beyond my duties." "Of course," Purbright replied. "Yet one sometimes notices things in the course of ordinary work. A slip of paper here, a misdelivered note there. These small details can be telling." Mrs. Sinclair's gaze flickered toward the window, where the church's shadowed silhouette stretched across the garden. Perhaps one envelope seemed unusual, but I did not think it significant," she admitted softly. "It could have been a mistake." By the afternoon, Purbright had orchestrated a gentle encounter with Dunsby, whose recent designation as the town's first obvious suspect had not escaped the public eye. In the hardware store, Purbright casually remarked upon the importance of meticulous accounting and minor oversights, deliberately observing Dunsby's reactions. The man's hands tightened slightly around a small box of screws, a momentary furrow in his brow betraying a flicker of concern before his customary composure returned. These orchestrated encounters, while ostensibly routine, allowed Purbright to observe subtle differences in behavior. Hesitations, micro-expressions, and small gestures formed a nuanced tableau, each movement revealing more than words could convey. Later, he convened a quiet discussion with the Reverend Canon Hadley, ostensibly to review the flower show's prize-giving schedule. Hadley, serene yet attentive, remarked on the importance of maintaining decorum. Purbright introduced a minor discrepancy in the ledger as a hypothetical scenario, noting Hadley's reaction. The vicar's expression, carefully controlled, revealed a slight tightening around the eyes and an almost imperceptible tilt of the head, small clues that Purbright filed carefully. By evening, the town had entered a subtle state of self-consciousness. Citizens moved with measured care, glancing at one another with mild suspicion, perhaps sensing the gentle probing of Purbright's attention. Even the children at the market square, usually oblivious to adult concerns, seemed to carry their whispers more cautiously. The envelope, the notebook, and the orchestrated encounters had collectively introduced a layer of uncertainty, causing the inhabitants to reveal tendencies and habits they might otherwise have concealed. Purbright, reviewing his notes by candlelight, considered the accumulated observations. The bent copper paperclip, the smudged ink, the envelope, the notebook, and the nuanced reactions of Dunsby, Tilling, Sinclair, and others collectively formed a pattern. None of the individuals had openly confessed, yet each had contributed, consciously or unconsciously, to the trail of evidence. The test he had set in motion controlled observation, gentle questioning, and subtle exposure to circumstances was yielding the precise data he required. He reflected on the manner in which Flaxborough's social equilibrium was both orderly and fragile. Minor perturbations, such as a misplaced object or an unusual envelope, had the capacity to elicit responses that revealed hidden anxieties, loyalties, and motives. Human nature, he noted, often betrayed itself in the smallest gestures, a glance, a pause, a carefully measured response. Purbright's next steps were becoming clear. The deliberate orchestration of minor scenarios, the careful observation of reactions, and the systematic compilation of seemingly trivial details were converging toward a coherent understanding of the events. The truth, he knew, lay not in hurried accusation, but in the patient alignment of behavior, timing, and subtle evidence. Before retiring for the night, Purbright reviewed his mental ledger. The first obvious suspect had been identified, additional individuals had emerged under scrutiny, trivial but odd details had been catalogued, and a second incident had expanded the investigative field. The stage was set for the careful revelation of the true architect of these seemingly minor disruptions, whose actions had orchestrated a quiet yet intricate social drama beneath the veneer of Flaxborough civility. He closed his notebook, satisfied that the groundwork had been laid. The town, for all its genteel composure, had unwittingly supplied the evidence he required. With patience, observation, and a subtle test of behavior, the final act of revelation was approaching one that would unfold with all the calm civility and understated precision characteristic of Flaxborough life. The next morning, Flaxborough awoke under the soft illumination of mist-laden light, the air carrying the faint scent of damp earth and polished cobblestones. Inspector Purbright, notebook in hand, moved through the quiet streets with the deliberate calm of a man accustomed to patience and observation. The town, having processed the second incident and absorbed the undercurrent of subtle tests, appeared outwardly tranquil, yet he sensed the concealed tension that always preceded revelation. He began his day with a final review of minor details, those seemingly insignificant fragments that had quietly accumulated. The bent copper paperclip found in the gutter, the small slip of paper exchanged at the hardware store, the envelope discreetly left in the vicarage garden, and the notebook beneath the pew. Each item, in isolation, could have been coincidental. In combination, they suggested intention, forethought, and the careful orchestration of perception. Purbright's attention first turned to Mr. Dunsby. Though the town had long focused suspicion upon him, the inspector recognized that overt concentration on a single figure rarely uncovered the subtle truth. Dunsby's recent gestures, a slight tremor of the hand, a fleeting glance at the notebook. A measured pause in conversation had been noted, but they were consistent with a man caught in the periphery of unfolding events, not necessarily their originator. The public, eager for simplicity, favored narratives with a single culprit. Yet Purbright understood that human behavior rarely conformed to convenient expectations. Next, he visited the postmistress, Mrs. Sinclair, ostensibly to discuss routine deliveries. She received him with her usual courtesy, yet Purbright observed subtle inconsistencies, glances toward the church, the faintly accelerated pace of her movements, and a minor adjustment of letters in the tray as he entered. These were small, easily dismissed by casual observers, yet they hinted at awareness of the ongoing scrutiny. Purbright made a careful note, understanding that knowledge often lay in the interaction between routine behavior and deviations from it. By late morning, he arranged a brief encounter with Mr. Tilling, the council clerk. Purbright introduced a hypothetical error in the flower show records, observing Tilling's reactions. The clerk's eyes flickered, hands paused mid-adjustment of papers, and a slight flush rose to his temples. Again, no overt confession, yet subtle evidence of mental engagement, concern, or perhaps preemptive consideration. Purbright filed each observation alongside those of previous days, constructing an intricate lattice of behavior, timing, and minor gestures. Around midday, Purbright called for the individuals of interest to gather at the parish hall under the guise of a routine review of the flower show accounts. The room filled with mild apprehension, though outwardly civility prevailed. Mrs. Lacey fussed over the placement of flowers on the side table, Dunsby adjusted his coat and sleeves, Mrs. Sinclair arranged letters with precision, and Tilling hovered near the doorway with a portfolio clutched in both hands. Each displayed its own form of restraint, a reflection of character, social expectation, and mild anxiety. Purbright began with gentle observation, letting the room settle. "It is remarkable," he said softly, "how minor discrepancies can reveal the underlying texture of human behavior. Consider the notebook discovered beneath the pew and the envelope found in the garden. Each was, ostensibly, trivial, yet each elicited responses that were informative." He allowed a pause, eyes moving slowly over the group. "We may not always recognize the significance of small actions, yet they reveal much about intention, observation, and awareness." He directed attention to the notebook first. Opening it, he traced the annotations, the initials, and the dates. "These entries," he said, "demonstrate meticulous care and a desire to communicate subtly, without overt disruption. One might ask why certain items were placed where they were, and why certain individuals reacted as they did." The group shifted uneasily. Mrs. Lacey's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a ribbon. Dunsby's jaw tightened. Tilling's eyes flickered toward the floor, and Sinclair's fingers lingered over the letters with faint hesitation. Purbright observed each reaction carefully, noting the smallest deviations from expected composure. Now Purbright continued, his tone calm, almost conversational. "One could hypothesize that the first obvious suspect, Mr. Dunsby, orchestrated these placements. Yet upon careful consideration, his behavior, while anxious, aligns more with a man caught in the periphery of events, rather than orchestrating them. One must look for subtler, quieter signals." He laid the envelope on the table, followed by the paperclip. "Each detail suggests a level of observation and forethought beyond mere happenstance. The handwriting, the precise placement, the timing all point to an individual familiar with the town's rhythms, aware of its inhabitants' habits, and intent on eliciting responses without causing alarm." He allowed another pause, letting the weight of his words settle. "The true orchestrator," he said finally, "is someone who understands human nature, who knows the power of subtle influence, and who can manipulate minor details to observe the effects on others. That person, through careful planning and an understanding of the social fabric, has guided these incidents from their inception." The group remained silent, tension and curiosity mingling in the air. Purbright's gaze softened, yet his expression retained that quiet intensity characteristic of his investigations. "In short," he said, "the orchestrator is not the first obvious suspect, nor merely those whose attention was drawn to routine duties. The truth emerges when one considers the combined observations, minor details, and reactions over time." He closed the notebook, allowing it to rest on the table. "The time for revelation draws near." The town, in its polite attention and careful observation, has provided all the evidence required. It is now a matter of aligning those details, tracing subtle signals, and recognizing the individual capable of orchestrating such a quiet and intricate sequence. As Purbright looked around the room, his eyes briefly meeting each participant's gaze, he sensed the silent anticipation. The stage was set for the final uncovering, the moment when patient observation, behavioral insight, and meticulous attention to human nature would reveal the true architect of the scandal beneath the church pew. The parish hall was suffused with the quiet hum of anticipation, a subdued tension that seemed to ripple beneath the town's accustomed politeness. Inspector Purbright, seated at the head of the long wooden table, allowed the assembled individuals to settle into a careful, measured silence. Mrs. Lacey, Dunsby, Tilling, Mrs. Sinclair, and even Hawthorne's assistant were present, each exhibiting a mixture of curiosity and mild apprehension. Purbright opened the notebook and placed the envelope beside it, the physical artifacts of the investigation resting like mute witnesses to a complex social dance. Over the past week, Purbright began, his tone calm, almost conversational. We have observed a series of events that, on the surface, appeared trivial: a notebook beneath a pew, an envelope left in a garden, minor anomalies in ledger entries. Yet, as I have quietly noted, these objects are less important than the reactions they provoked, the patterns they revealed, and the subtle cues they allowed us to observe. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to register. The individuals present shifted slightly, their attention heightened. The town, in its usual fashion, quickly identified a first suspect. Mr. Dunsby, whose conscientious habits and visible concern drew the attention of onlookers, became the focus of speculation. Yet while his reactions were instructive, they reveal a man responding to circumstances, not orchestrating them. Dunsby's jaw tightened, though he remained silent, nodding faintly as if acknowledging Purbright's point, without overt protest. Purbright turned his gaze toward the council clerk. Likewise, Mr. Tilling, whose nervousness and timing might suggest involvement, was in fact acting out of routine awareness, responding to circumstances without being the originator of them. And Mrs. Sinclair's careful attention to letters again, a reflection of conscientious diligence rather than deliberate interference. He allowed another pause, letting the subtle implications sink in. The room was silent, the only sound the faint creak of the hall's polished floorboards. The critical observation, Purbright continued, lies in the deliberate placement of objects, the timing of minor events, and the responses they elicited. The orchestrator understood human nature, the town's rhythms, and the effect of trivial anomalies on collective attention. He opened the envelope and laid the slip of paper flat on the table. Notice the precision of the handwriting, the careful notation, and the faint smudge indicating the writer's attention to detail. Compare this with the annotations in the notebook, initials, dates, and minor corrections. Both suggest the hand of someone meticulous, deliberate, and familiar with the town's social patterns. The assembled group exchanged glances. Mrs. Lacey's fingers twitched slightly. Dunsby's eyes darted toward the vicar, and even Tilling's posture stiffened, a faint blush rising to his temples. Purbright allowed the moment to linger before continuing. Having observed responses to these minor disruptions, noting the behavior, gestures and hesitations of each involved party, it becomes evident who possessed both the knowledge and the foresight to orchestrate these incidents. He looked around the table slowly, meeting each gaze with his calm, measured eyes. The individual who carefully engineered both the notebook's appearance and the subsequent envelope, while subtly manipulating reactions without overt action, is none other than Hawthorne's assistant. A collective intake of breath swept across the room. The young man's hands fell to his sides, eyes wide but composed, a faint blush spreading across his cheeks. Purbright continued, undisturbed by the mild shock that rippled through the others. "Consider the behavior we observed," Purbright said. "Attention to detail beyond that required for routine tasks, subtle placement of minor objects, familiarity with the town's habitual movements, and an awareness of human psychology sufficient to predict the reactions of others. All signs pointed not to the first obvious suspect, nor to the individuals whose routine tasks coincided with these incidents, but to a figure quietly positioned at the periphery, watching, learning, and orchestrating without drawing undue attention." The assistant exhaled softly, nodding, acknowledging the truth without overt protest. Purbright, in his measured tone, allowed the natural civility of Flaxborough to assert itself. "No harm was intended," he added. "The aim was not malice but observation to test, in a controlled manner, the subtle currents of human behavior and social expectation within the town. Mrs. Lacey exhaled a sharp breath, recovering from the initial shock. "Well," she said, "I dare say it was most ingenious, though I cannot help feeling mildly affronted that our attentiveness has been examined." Dunsby chuckled faintly, releasing the tension in his shoulders. "Ingenious, yes, but nerve-wracking. One might almost call it an educational exercise in patience." Purbright smiled subtly. "Indeed, the exercise has revealed the interplay between observation, expectation, and social response. It is a quiet study of human nature, conducted with minimal disruption, yet sufficient to demonstrate the hidden rhythms of our interactions. The town's participants, gradually absorbing the implications, allowed themselves small smiles and muted acknowledgements. Flaxborough had witnessed disruption, subtle manipulation, and a minor scandal, yet all had resolved without overt conflict, scandal, or lasting discord. Later, as the individuals departed, exchanging polite farewells and minor reflections, Purbright returned to his desk in the quiet of his lodgings. The notebook and envelope, once objects of intrigue, lay neatly arranged before him. He reviewed his notes one last time, the careful observations, the subtle cues, and the alignment of minor details that had revealed the truth. The town, in its usual fashion, resumed its rhythm. Flower beds were tended, letters delivered, and the high street filled with the gentle bustle of daily life. Yet beneath the calm, a slight awareness persisted, a reminder that even the most orderly towns conceal the intricacies of human behavior, waiting for the patient observer to discern them. Purbright, satisfied with the culmination of his quiet investigation, turned to his paperwork, the faint smile of accomplishment resting on his lips. Flaxborough had revealed its patterns, its subtle secrets, and its character all beneath the seemingly ordinary surface of a notebook beneath a church pew.